we have approached a boundary beyond which it would be very dangerous to go. And so we have now two systems in fundamental, profound conflict with one another, the capitalist system and the climate system.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 22 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media.
It's amazing that suddenly what has been pretty well-established science for the last 20 years is now making it into the mainstream media. Not in time for the election, of course, because that would just be a little too disruptive of business as normal. But we can finally hear a little bit about how bad things are and stop the media prevaricating about it and trying to give balance or whatever else. To the extent that, you know, this was the cover of Bloomberg's Business Week the week after Sandy, when he ultimately endorsed Barack Obama as somebody who might do something more about climate change, even though the Obama White House took a decision in 2009, supported by many large environmental groups, unfortunately, not to mention the word climate change or the phrase climate change anymore. So if you go back for the last two and a half years or so, the Democrats have not mentioned that phrase because they thought that they would just talk about clean energy. Now, then it becomes unsurprising that we've gone backwards in many ways over the last 3 years with regard to coming up with some kind of policy about addressing this issue. When, how are you going to argue for something that and propose policy changes and saying we should be spending billions of dollars on this if you will not give the reason why you're going to be doing it in the first place? So you've just totally undermined any possibility for any forward momentum around this issue. And so that's exactly what we basically see. On the other hand, so the media is talking about this. People may well have seen the fact that the World Bank just issued about a month or so ago, a report saying that we were now on track for 4 degrees C of warming, and pretty much any climate scientist will tell you 2 degrees is the absolute maximum that we can have a world that still resembles the one that we're accustomed to and we were born into. And now the World Bank of all organizations put out an 84-page report saying that 4 degrees Celsius is much more likely now. And that would entail a world that is completely different to the one, even vaguely resembling the one that we currently have over the next 50 or 60 years or so, because the world hasn't been that much different in terms of being that much warmer for the last 30 million years. So in terms of that much colder, you'd have to go back 20,000 years to the last ice age, when where we are now was under 2 miles of ice. So you can imagine what kind of changes that would bring to the deserts, to rainfall patterns, to where you have drought or where you have flash flooding, to ultimately sea level rise, and so on and so forth. And we're just getting the very beginning. A lot of people used to think about climate change as being something, well, for your kids or your grandkids or something, but it's climate change is now. And we're just getting the very beginning taste of that level of instability, obviously most recently with Hurricane Sandy. And what they mentioned in the film there is the fact that already sea level rise has exacerbated the problem. So we have very accurate records going back the last 100 years for Battery Park and the sea level there in New York City, and it's gone up 12 inches over the last 100 years. So whatever was a problem before is now 12 inches more of a problem. The average temperature in New York City is 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit more than it used to be 100 years ago. So we've already made pretty radical changes, and now we're on the cusp of kind of point of no return almost, in terms of once you go beyond 2, then you're headed towards 3 with all the feedback mechanisms, and 4, and so on and so forth. So we live in fairly desperate times, as was really kind of sensationalized with that clip that you saw, but which Stanley got together, which is very useful, I think, in kind of framing what we're talking about. But I don't want to spend too much time on that, because I think a lot of environmental analysis kind of begins and ends with that side of things. It's like the Old Testament without the redemption side of stuff. So I think that we need to understand why it's happening, and we also need to have some kind of real solutions, in contrast to the kind of solutions that are put forward, to the extent that even solutions are put forward these days. This election, as people may well know, was the first election since 1984 when climate change was not an issue or not mentioned in any of the presidential debates. It's been mentioned in every presidential debate since 1988, when it was James Hansen first testified to Congress. So even though the science and the effect of what's climate change has become so much more radically obvious, the political side of things are doing nothing. I mean, really nothing, if not going backwards. And you have to ask your question. Have to ask a question, why is that? I mean, even George Bush talked about climate change more than the current crop of politicians. So what has changed about the world, other than the fact that climate change has become much more real? And why? When you think about the fact that there are 100 million Americans, United States people, who live within 3 feet of sea level. So that's 1/3 of the population of the country, potentially at risk. Most of the major cities are obviously on the coasts. Sea level is rising about 60% faster in the Northeast. It happens to be a hotspot for sea level rise than the rest of the world. And obviously it's not like New York didn't get a warning 12 months ago, right? Irene came within 6 inches of doing exactly what Hurricane Sandy did. So, and now you have to ask the question, so what's going to happen 12 months from now? This disaster has costing, apart from all the suffering and the heartbreak and the dislocation of everybody's lives just on a personal level, it's also 50 billion and rising. So despite all of this going on, there doesn't seem to be any indication, as far as I can see, there's no evidence to support the contention that the system as it's currently structured has any momentum in a different direction. It is continuing. In fact, not only is it continuing with what it's doing, I'm talking about capitalism, it shows no sign of even slowing down. Quite the opposite, actually. It's accelerating. So that we use 80 million barrels of oil every single day around the world, which is quite a startling fact in and of itself when you actually think about that number, right? You're talking about drilling out of the ground and setting fire to 80 million barrels of oil every single day, 20 million of which are burnt in this country. So in other words, 25% of that is the United States, which actually starts to give you a clue as to why we're not doing anything about it. But that number is predicted to increase, not decrease, increase to 110 million barrels by 2020, with a large percentage of that increase coming from increased extraction in the United States, off the continental shelf, in the Gulf Coast, for the first time ever, offshore drilling in the Arctic, increased drilling in Wyoming and other places, Texas, deeper. And just like you can frack for natural gas, you can frack for oil too, and so they're doing that. So these new techniques are allowing for enhanced exploration for oil and natural gas too, to the extent that there is now a glut of natural gas, and that's why it's so cheap. And so what is the effect of that? Well, in contrast to all the arguments about, well, natural gas can be some kind of transitional bridge fuel to the future, natural gas is cheap. What does that mean in capitalism terms? It means that it's undercutting coal. What does that mean? Well, the coal companies can't sell the coal here because it's more expensive than natural gas. Well, they're not going to not sell it. So what are they doing? They're exporting it to China. So coal exports from the United States, coal exports are at record highs because they are exporting it, and now they're building new terminals on the Pacific West Coast in order to export more coal. So China is busily building as many coal plants as it possibly can in order to do what? Build things with offshore US companies in order to re-import that stuff back to sell to us. Politically, though, it's great for the United States government because they can turn around and say, well, look, China's producing all these CO2 emissions. They're building all these coal plants. It's outrageous. Why should we do anything when China's doing this? Of course, what they don't tell you is they are actually burning US coal in their coal plants. And so this system is absolutely insane. I mean, apart from the CO2 emissions, we shouldn't even be burning something that is so despicably toxic. Is a 19th century technology that doesn't just emit more CO2 than any other fossil fuel, which would be a good enough reason to do something in the first place, but is the main creator of acid rain because of the sulfur dioxide and the nitrogen dioxide, is one of the main creators of the soot particles that we're all breathing in right now that are too tiny for our bodies to be able to not inhale, but then will not come out again either, so are leading to many excess, thousands of premature deaths, and not to mention many respiratory illnesses, asthma and so on and so forth, from these particulate emissions. And then, why is tuna have such high concentrations of mercury, for example? What's going on with the tuna? They're in the oceans. Well, the reason that they're so high in mercury and arsenic is primarily to do with the burning of coal. Because you burn rock that's been under the ground, not only is it radioactive, that's another thing we get from coal, but it has high concentrations of heavy metals. So the number of things, negative impacts of coal is just enormous. Apart from the fact that if you've got a thermal plant, if you're just burning the coal to make steam, you're taking that water from the rivers and you're putting it back into the rivers or into the atmosphere at a warmer temperature than you took it out. And so that's also having a local effect too. Apart from the fact that where do you get the coal from? I mean, this could just go on and on, right? Where do you get the coal from? You blow the tops off mountains in Appalachia. And you don't bother about health and safety because you never had to because the government wasn't looking besides that. So, all along the line, we've got a disastrous system that would be depressing, or I would be depressed, if we didn't have the answers already. But we know what the answers are, and we've known for at least 20 or 30 years, I would say, really. The energy from the energy that the world uses, the total amount of energy that we use is 15 terawatts, which is a lot of energy, right? I don't know whether that number means anything, but let me put it in context for you. The energy that comes from the sun is 101,000 terawatts. So you're comparing global energy use of 15 to what's just coming from the sun of 101,000. So that would mean you'd have to capture a tiny fraction of 1%, way less than 1%, of the energy from the sun, and you could power the world. Now, I'm not saying that we would do that, right? We would have other plans, wind, and we would have to think about things. But it does illustrate what is possible. And Germany is already in the middle of doing some of that, right? Germany has the same solar insolation approximately as Alaska. And somehow or another, Germany has already got to 25% renewable energy. It's closing down all of its nuke plants by 2022 because of Fukushima and because of the mass protests in Germany. And also because of Chernobyl and many other things before that. There's a whole historical memory of activism and political activism there. So if Germany can do that, and actually there were 4 German states this year that had 50% of their electricity from solar in combination with wind. And the good thing about combining solar and wind is obviously solar works in the day, but it tends to be windier at night. So if you combine those two things, then you're already on your way to a reliable energy system. And if the 4th largest economy in the world feels that they can do it, and obviously even the German capitalists are for this. I mean, they've been pushed into it, and there are various other geopolitical reasons to do with the fact that Germany has no oil and lost the Second World War, and because of oil and lots of other things. But the fact that it's possible in one country obviously indicates that it's possible in another, and this is the richest country in the world by far. So the idea that it couldn't be done here is just idiotic. It doesn't make any sense. There's actually a glut of solar panels in the world at the moment. China has made so many solar panels they can't sell them, but they're being hindered by the fact that the US just slapped tariffs, import tariffs on Chinese solar panels to prevent them selling them in this country cheaply. So when you should be like, well, we want to go solar, doesn't matter who's making them, let's have your solar panels. So of course this country has tons of solar possibilities. The other interesting thing about Germany is much of it is actually distributed energy. So actually local communities have much more control of their utility, because their utility is actually them, as opposed to Con Ed or whatever. So that's kind of the global picture. And you look at New York, and Mayor Bloomberg. I could read the quote of his from 2009, where he said, "Look, it would be way better for us to protect our infrastructure and invest now, than take the risk of a few years down the road having to fix things after a major disaster. So we should spend the money now." Of course, that didn't happen. Self-evidently did not happen. So not only were we warned, but they were actually talking about knowing this stuff. Con Ed said 3 years ago also, said that what they needed to spend to make their electrical system in New York more resilient to possible storm damage was $250 million. $250 million. But they only spent a tenth of that because they redirected the money towards more profitable things. Even though last year, Con Ed, in profits alone, Con Ed made $1 billion. And yet they still did not spend it on submersible switches and moving their transformers up to higher ground, which may well have prevented the explosions in Lower Manhattan that darkened Lower Manhattan for a week when one of their transformers blew. I think we've now basically reached a point where we have found out the limits to which the planet, a stable climate, the biosphere, can absorb the treatment that it's getting in terms of CO2 emissions and other forms of pollutant and so on, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. We have approached a boundary beyond which it would be very dangerous to go. And so we have now two systems in fundamental, profound conflict with one another, the capitalist system and the climate system. And there is no indication, as I mentioned earlier, that capitalism is going to change course. So we have to do some things in the meantime. We have to fight and campaign for things that we can do within the system as it currently exists. So fairly simple things. I mean, this university, for example, there is a campaign started by 350. Whatever people might think or not think about 350, there is a divestment campaign to force university campuses to open their books and show the students that pay the tuition what the university is investing in, and divest from anything that is fossil fuel related. So that's a good campaign, right? To highlight something. That can be done. University of Maine has already done it under pressure. So that's something that students can do, for example. On a bigger scale, how can we argue and fight for not reduced spending on social services, but increased spending? Because there are so many jobs that we need doing that, I mean, part of the reason that we couldn't get New York back on its feet sooner was because they fired all the public sector workers. We should be doubling the number of public sector workers because we need so many more things being done. The sewage system is an absolute travesty in terms of how efficient it is because it's been underinvested for years. Actually, the ex-head of the MTA just said, you know, the reason that we couldn't do anything is because the infrastructure has been allowed to rot for the last 15 years. And so there are many, many things that we could do infrastructure-wise. I mean, when you think about the national park system, when did that come about? The 1930s. As a government program. There would be no national park system with all the trails and all the fantastic things that go on in national parks for people to enjoy without people being employed in the 1930s to do that. So we need a new energy grid. We need some, I wanted to take the train up here, but it would have taken 2.5 hours. Like, it's 70 miles from New York. That means the train is going at an average of less than 35 miles an hour. It's like, that was the average speed of a train in the 1800s. You know, and I went to Fukushima in January, and you can step onto like 5 different types of train, going from, you know, 350 miles an hour on down. It's like unbelievable. And yet, you know, this is the 1800s in terms of public transportation. So, you know, I think those are some of the things that we could be looking at and fighting in conjunction, not just the social movements, but also with the unions, the rank and file of the unions. But longer term, I do think that we need to have a radically different system. And if capitalism is based on 3 things, it's competition in the pursuit of profit with a lack of real democracy, which means exploitation, warfare, racism, sexism, homophobia. There just aren't enough capitalists to have, well, there aren't enough police to have it work any other way without that kind of oppression coming along with it. But what about a system that was based instead of on competition but on cooperation, which actually is the vast majority of human history has been based on cooperation? Real democracy, so we're the ones who are deciding what we should and shouldn't produce and how we should produce them. Not production for make things because they make money, but make things because they make sense, because we need them. I think if you had a system based on that, you'd be asking completely different questions about the products that we make. Everybody knows they basically deliberately make products to fail as fast as possible so that you have to buy more, right? That's what keeps the system. The system is now so productive, so enormously productive. I mean, they make 70 million cars every single year. It's like, you know, there's one statistic in Scientific American that what would it take to power the world? And they reckoned about 3.8 million large wind turbines and 90,000 solar arrays. So 3.8 million wind turbines sounds like a lot, right? We've got to make 3.8 million wind turbines. They make 70 million cars every year. So, you know, it's not even like we would have to increase production in order to take care of the developing world and transition those two. It's actually, we could probably decrease, especially if you take out advertising and the military and all the waste inherent to capitalism. I think that you know, those things are eminently possible, and I think we could live in a completely different society. I think the more ecological and socially just response. How could we actually make New York a livable city for people as opposed to cars, where you have the soft edges around the edges, you reinstitute the wetlands, which would bring back all kinds of other advantages, as people can no doubt extrapolate from. You bring back the oysters, you clean up the bay, you institute natural reefs again, and you recreate what New York used to be like 100 years ago, but on a more high-tech basis. And there have been plans, actually. There was a plan that was displayed at MoMA in 2010, where 5 different architectural teams competed to redesign the city on a green basis. and would make it climate resilient. And you can look at it on the MoMA side. It's like fantastic ideas, really exciting, that would actually make New York, instead of this crazy place where, you know, I live and you take your life in your hands every time you step off the pavement, or actually half the time on the pavement, because the cars are like, you know, they run things. Then apart from the noise and the pollution and whatever else, there's this psychological damage that everybody experiences from living in New York City. So, you know, I think that none of these things are really being talked about with any kind of seriousness, even though it's far more expensive to do the alternative. Although, you know, in 1956, James Baldwin was in disagreement with William Faulkner, who was arguing for a go slow approach to integration on overcoming segregation and so on. And he argued in an essay in 1956 for a re-envisioning of what was possible, and I think that that's what we need to do now. So I will close with a quote from him. "Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, the end of safety. And at such a moment, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will now bring, one clings to what one knew, or thought one knew, to what one possessed or dreamed that one possessed. Yet it is when a man is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream he has long cherished or a privilege he had long possessed, that he is set free. He has set himself free for higher dreams, for greater privileges." And I think that is the kind of expansive vision that we need for an entirely new planet before the capitalists wreck the only one that we have. Thanks very much.
We'd like to hear your comments about our program. Reach us at mail@thestruggle.org. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.
When the world has gone crazy and it's all becoming clear, when they're gunning down our comrades and it seems the end is near, as they're loading up the launchers for the tear gas grenades, we can take off our bandanas and kiss behind the barricades. When it's madness all around and you can see this at a glance, we will sing and we will cry, we will laugh and we will dance, as they shout their marching orders beneath the helicopter blades. We shall seize the moment for a kiss behind the barricades.